Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about the Salem witch trials. Occult video number, I think this is 37, maybe 38, I'm not exactly sure. These Salem witch trials are one of those sort of perennial Halloween time fixtures. I figured I'd talk about it before Halloween. Fruits of Eden's done now. Had to get that done within 2 weeks of Halloween. It's the 18th, a couple weeks. And it's that great day, when the dead come back to communicate with the living, usually using pumpkins in some way, shape, or form, or by possessing small children that happen to be dressed up as witches or whatever. The Christians get real uppity on that day. I find it very funny. You'll notice that I'm wearing 3 layers at the moment. I'm cold. I can't help it. It's like, fall into 30 degrees outside. Anyway, my thoughts on the Salem witch trials are this. If you look at the sort of material which has been written about it over time, you'll find that despite the fact that the accounts of what actually happened on a physical level, the trials themselves and the lead up to the trials, those are fairly well documented because the people in Salem at the time documented it in legal proceedings. They literally looked at it as a form of legalism insofar as they were concerned. It was essentially more or less a secular trial that really led to all of these different convictions for witchery. Some of the details aren't completely clear, but there have been multiple takes on specifically why the Salem witch trials happened. Of course, when you're talking about like the burning times of the Inquisitors in Europe, you're not really talking about the period in which the Salem witch trials took place. You're talking about several centuries earlier, generally speaking. The Enlightenment had already happened. It's very only in Puritan New England would this have actually really taken off at the time. Other parts, oddly enough, today in the modern age, New England is sort of the atheistic secular seat of what you might consider neoliberal thought within the United States, here and in California especially. Back then it was exactly the opposite. Back then the Puritans, the really religious freaks, they were the ones in New England. The Mid-Atlantic and the sort of southern states were more secular. They were where all the big sort of white-collar plantation owners and so forth had settled, made their larger establishments. They were more into science and had sort of the leisure to learn, as opposed to the Puritans who were living much like feudal serfs, really, when you really think about it. Independent owners, yes, maybe, but their quality of life was more along the lines of what you would consider feudal characteristics. The first take on the Salem witch trials, essentially, if you can go back over a century to find this, was that it was just a period of moral hysteria. That is, that in a hyper-religious society, anytime anything went wrong, the cow bloated up and died. The turnips didn't grow. There was an early frost. It killed off some of their grain or something like that. Anytime something like that happened, the people in these communities, these very religious communities, construed it as having some sort of cosmic or divine importance. That is, they had done something wrong and God was punishing them. God was testing them. Satan was amongst them. Witches had cursed them. And of course, with witches, it gave a more tangible way for them to actually combat it. If you think that God has cursed you for doing something wrong, you may be in the dark as to what you specifically have done. The members of your community, any one of them could be that sinner that brought this great terroristic plague upon you. With witches, it was different, though. You could use secular authority to try to hunt down and find who the witches actually were and prosecute them in that manner, which is something you can't really do with the devil, with God or something in these communities, in these religious communities. This is sort of the secular, rational explanation for what happened that comes from that same period of scientific thought that gives us things like Haxan, the first comprehensive, somewhat, documentary on like witchcraft and the devil, the first sort of what you would call early scientific studies of phenomena that you would prior have ascribed purely to the spiritual. That's when this period happens, from Scandinavia and France especially. You have a great deal of such literature. Some of it comes from the Americas, some from England and Germany. A lot of it was Scandinavian, actually, Sweden especially. a great deal of science at the time, specifically applied to what we now consider cryptids, spiritual, cosmological things, astronomy, and so forth. It comes all from Sweden, especially, but the North European region especially, and France as well. Of course, Napoleon's voyages around to dig up archaeological relics, the early sort of colonial archaeology, that's of import too. So that's the first period. The first explanation for Salem is, well, they panicked, something went wrong, their crops didn't grow, something happened. They cast around for blame. They have this rather convenient, they have Tituba, the house slave, and sort of the old beggar woman, and the divorced woman, and the widowed woman, and these various sort of social outcasts became a convenient excuse for them to witch hunt after. Specifically, it wasn't the girls making the claims themselves were little more than a sort of religious tool to prosecute individuals they suspected of doing something wrong that had in some way inflamed the situation, in some way cursed their settlement. That's the first. Then you get the sort of further rationalization, the psychedelic rationalization, which takes off of that same sort of Scandinavian Haxan material, in which you have the first sort of view of witching ointment being not, some mythological, magical brew, so much as a drug of some sort that convinces you can fly. You have the period in which ergot especially enters into the lexicon of the Salem witch trials. That is, the idea was that the girls, through no fault of their own, just happened to ingest some tainted material, some tainted rye or whatever, gutter-godamine poisoning. They did see things that they thought were demonic, and then, goaded on perhaps by others who were still of sound mind, they then proceeded to identify people that they had seen these delusional visions surrounding as witches. The reason why I don't like this explanation, the ergot poisoning explanation, the datura explanation, any of these associated things, these girls for a number of months continued to make their claims. Certainly if a person survives ergotamine poisoning at all, they're not going to continue in their psychosis. At least you wouldn't expect all of those afflicted to continue in their psychosis for such a long period of time. They may have been driven utterly mad by it as well and not even be able to testify. Even in those superstitious times, their testimony would not have been considered valid because they'd be a raving lunatic at that point, having ingested enough ergot. It also doesn't explain nobody else in these communities has any symptoms. Now, you would naturally expect, if they're sort of pooling their grain together and ingesting it, you would expect at least all of the children in the community to be afflicted, because it takes less ergotamine to poison them. If it's datura related, you would not expect them to have even been coherent for the first few days. After that, they would have gone back to relative normal thought processes if they survived, let's face it. You would expect other sporadic outbreaks of the same, but no, indeed that doesn't happen. I think that the symptoms of sort of going into fits and flashes of heat and cold and seeing all sorts of weird things and feeling, prickles all over your body, yeah, that fits in with certain psychedelic substances. It does not explain why they persisted in their claims for a period of time, because you would expect others in the community to have been affected by the same syndromes over time, at least sporadically. If indeed the bread was tainted by ergotamine using the storehouse methods back then, everybody would have potentially been poisoned to some degree. And yet we don't have any evidence of that. So I personally, even though it fits, if you rationalize it and assume that they were showing symptoms of psychosis in some degree, yes, it fits. But it doesn't fit the social context. The context within the whole community at the time doesn't appear to fit the symptomology of ergotamine poisoning or anything like that. So that one, I believe, has been discredited. Then in the late 70s and into the 80s, with the new wave of feminism that occurred then, in a lot of these sort of documentary materials regarding the Salem witch trials, you would think of the In Search Of series with Nimoy and so forth. You have people who said, well, it was the patriarchal culture of the time. These girls, for some reason, that they did ingest ergot somehow, or datur or whatever, or they had mental breakdowns. Something happened, and they just started sort of blaming other people in the community, because as soon as they started making these claims, they realized that they were getting all sorts of attention, and they were now central to the functions of their region. As such, because you have a patriarchal society that relegates women to essentially just a step above livestock at the time, that they continued wanting that attention, and so they simply expanded their claims over time, that it was all make-believe for the most part, that they were lashing out, that they were essentially attempting to denigrate the society around them in some sort of psychological manner. And that it really has to do with the strictly religious, number one, and number two, very patriarchal society at the time. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think this is an attempt at culturally Marxist revisionism. I don't see any evidence that that's the case. If this had something to do with woman power or something like that, you would not have expected most of those that got hanged to be female. In fact, most of them were. Of course, there were a few males as well. The funny thing is, back then you could be a witch and be male. If you look back at the true burning, if you look back at like the hex and hammer tradition, it seems like the authorities primarily used witch finding stuff to sexually investigate and molest various women that they happened to want to see and play with naked. Because they were given power to do so. It called for stripping the witch down and poking and prodding them and so forth. Oftentimes, I think one thing people don't seem to understand is that most of those that were ever investigated for witchcraft were not hanged. They were not burned. They were not crushed to death or thrown in a river. They weren't killed at all. Most of them, if they were found guilty at all and confessed and repented and so forth, they were let go of. They would be reinvestigated, but as long as there was no further suspicion, they actually didn't face any punishment. A lot of the people at Salem did not get killed. Only a small proportion of the people blamed for witchcraft in Salem got killed. These were the people that, in the one individual, I can't remember his name, who got crushed with the rocks, he simply refused to testify. And so they couldn't hang him, so they decided to crush him to death. Everyone else that was actually killed in Salem were people that refused to confess. If a person confessed, said, oh yeah, well, sorry, yeah, I did witchcraft, they let him go. They didn't kill them. That's the funny thing. The people that died really were martyrs for their own innocence. And then in the new modern period, the post-feminist, post-psychedelia, post-early rationalization of what had gone on at Salem, in the new period, people take a sort of conspiratorial mindset to it, sort of the Dan Brown novel vision towards all of these old strange events, as they do with many other things. And they say, oh, well, it was actually a property dispute. Those that were making the claims were forcing these children to give this testimony to go after people from other communities whose land they wanted. I'm not sure that there's actually any evidence to suggest that that's the case. The thing is, this relies upon the backdrop of property disputes that, yes, were happening within the region. But at the same time, property disputes happened all over the United States and in Europe at the time, and we don't have any specific evidence that witchery and inquisition tactics were ever used as an offensive weapon by any of these groups against any of these other groups. More often, it seems that they would have either killed each other in the streets, or ambushed one another hunting in the woods, or dragged them through court. But it wouldn't have made sense to do it in this fashion. It would have taken a relatively high amount of intelligence and quite a manipulative character to use it in this manner. Also, there's no real connection. All the people that get blamed for witchcraft, one of them is the wife of the governor at the time. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to claim that this individual, who is not competing for the land anywhere near Salem, who's nowhere near Salem physically, doesn't have any land holdings there, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for a group that wanted to misuse the law by usurping it with some weird religious claim of witchcraft. to go after such a high positioned figure, thus screwing their own. That was shortly thereafter the cases stopped and they refused to investigate further because they realized how shitty a situation it was when, you know, you got the governor breathing down your neck all of a sudden. It wouldn't have made a lot of sense. That one claim that was made about the governor's wife at the time, I think, completely destroys the it was a property dispute argument, because any sensible, sane, rational individual, if they were using these young girls to try to take away other people's property by forcing it into sale, by getting people hanged for witchcraft or getting people tried for witchcraft or whatever, would not have made such a fantastical claim about somebody who can end the investigation at a whim, and probably would. It wouldn't have made sense. So the psychedelic argument, the feminized argument, and the property dispute argument, to me, they don't make a whole lot of sense. I've paid lip service before tacitly to the psychedelic argument. On further consideration, though, you would have expected to see other people fall ill. You wouldn't have expected the symptoms to last for weeks and months. Wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, really. I think ultimately the original argument made in the early period of rationalization is probably the best fitting. That is the one that would be made in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which is, yeah, you know, extremely religious people, bad things happen. When they happen, these groups find somebody to blame. They can't blame God. Not only it goes against their religious beliefs, but there's nothing you can do about it if God's cursing you. They can't hunt down the devil. They can't go out in the woods and find Satan and beat him over the head with a log. But what can they go after? They can go after witches. It made a lot more sense. They're simply trying to, in their own religious way, rationalize why bad things happened in their community, whatever they happen to be. It was probably food or disease related, as it often was in that time period. And they simply went out and they found people on the margins of society, which is why among the people killed, former pastor who no longer has religious sway necessarily, small farming community, peasantry, household slave, widow, you know, mistress perhaps of some local baron or something. These are people on the margins of society. These are people for whom there aren't necessarily a lot of others to speak on their behalf as to their character. Towards the end, people started coming out and defending those that were blamed for witchery, even at the hazard of themselves being called a witch. I think that eventually people realized, well, if I just fucking confess, they're going to let me go anyway, so what's the fucking point? You know, they might confiscate my land, but I didn't get hanged. I can always move back to Boston or something. People appear to have realized this towards the end. When they start blaming the governor's wife as a witch, as being possessed by the devil, that's when a lot of these other rationalizations really break down. If you assume that the people were simply lashing out because of a bad situation in their religious mannerisms, then they wouldn't have had any apprehension about blaming higher-ups for their problems. It wouldn't be nonsensical to do so, because they're simply attempting to hunt down and destroy all these witches. If, however, you believe it's due to patriarchy, why are most of the people getting blamed women? If it's due to psychedelia, why do they continue doing so long? And if it's about property, why would they go after people who weren't even in their community? They had no hope. I mean, what possible purpose would it serve to say that somebody 3 towns away is a witch? You're certainly not going to obtain their property. You don't even live in their community. So I think that those 3 more modern rationalizations are actually more inept than the original rationalizations made about the Salem witch trials by people who themselves, in that sort of late 1800s, early 1900s period, even they had a lack of breadth of science as we have today, and yet their explanation, I think, is closer to the truth, honestly. These other arguments, especially the property dispute argument, which is, it's the newest argument. It's an internet age, largely, argument to be made. And yet it's the least adequate at describing what went on, really, in Salem. So yeah, a bunch of people died. More people, oddly enough, did not die. Yeah, they were tortured. They were thrown in a cold jail cell, and some of them died there. As far as the number of people executed, it was actually a fraction of the number of people that were blamed. A lot more people could have died. You almost have to give credit, because a bunch of backwards, rubish zealots living several hundred years ago were even themselves capable of utilizing secular legal systems to spare most of the lives involved. For back then, that's actually almost very strange, really, that people would have been spared hanging after confessing to witchcraft. They didn't kill them if they confessed. Generally speaking, if someone said, "Well, yes, I'm an acolyte of the devil, and I'm going to keep afflicting your crops, and I'm going to destroy all of you," yeah, they'd probably, burn you at the stake for that. But if a person said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I was dabbling in witchcraft. The devil made me do it. I was tricked by Satan," then they would let you go. They would expect you, obviously, to be very repentant and sorry for what you did, but they didn't hang you. Another misconception that I should probably clear up: swimming the witch, the English tradition. The idea that you would throw the witch, so-called, into a river or a lake, and they would float if they were guilty, and then you'd kill them. And if they sank, then they still died. They drowned, but they were innocent. They died innocently. They actually pulled them back out. They didn't let them drown. They may have accidentally let a couple of them drown. Most people back then couldn't swim anyway. All you had to do was exhale, and then they'd pull you right out. So not exactly the most, shall we say, sophisticated methods of determining guilt. But then again, remember, at the same time, they also had a practice where they would put a rock in a pot of boiling water and force your hand in there, and you'd grab the rock and pull it out, and you'd be covered in blisters, and then they'd bandage it, and if your wounds festered, you got killed because you were obviously evil. If you started to heal, it was all good. Can't imagine the average person heals in those conditions when you're in a cramped, dingy dungeon filled with rats and trash and human shit. Yeah, I imagine most people probably got executed after that. So some misconceptions. I favor the oldest explanations for the Salem witch trials over most of the new ones. I think the whole Dan Brown bullshit conspiracy over property valuations and sort of the feminist critique of it, and the sort of new age psychedelia, oh, they got poisoned by ergot, they just don't make sense. On their face, perhaps they have some merit. They're great, interesting analyses of the situation, but they don't ultimately hold much water. So there you go, a little bit about the Salem witch trials. Thought I'd make that, even though I'm kind of hunched over here trying to keep warm. Can't help it. The weather outside is frightful, and Halloween hopefully will be far more delightful. That's about all.